Good evening, everyone, to all those who are joining us from here in India, and afternoon and morning to the ones who are joining us from the other parts of the world. I'm your host, Mashood. Um, the goals of SDG 4, which focus on education, puts a lot of focus on inclusion of those who have been socially and economically marginalized, or have been historically marginalized, who might be disadvantaged because of a disability. And it is only through uh, a vision and a policy of inclusive education, which puts social justice at the very center of it, can we really ensure that no child is left behind, and truly the world as a whole can progress. Inequality is something which prevents further progress of nations and the world as a whole. And to dissect this idea of social justice and inclusive education today, we have a thought leader, a global thought leader on the idea of social justice, who is joining us. He has been a legendary figure in the area of education. In South Africa, he was a national commissioner on the Committee for Education Support Services. He was appointed by none other than President Nelson Mandela himself to investigate into the area of special education during South Africa's transition to democracy as well. He has also served as a chief director of the inclusive education in the Western Cape Education. He's a professor extraordinary at the University of Western Cape in Cape Town, and has been a very passionate writer and speaker with respect to inclusive education in South Africa and the rest of the developing world as well. So it's a true honor for us to welcome Professor Sigamoney Naicker to speak here at dtalks, and to speak on his vision for change towards social justice and education. Professor Sigamoney, thank you so much for joining us here on dtalks, and we would love to learn about your thoughts, and we look forward to your presentation, after which we'll also have some questions for discussion as well.
Thank you, Mr. Butt. I'm going to talk about social justice in education very broadly, but I'm also going to make reference to India. Now, I'm no expert on education in India, and I think the challenges in India are huge. And, we in South Africa, we are actually a microcosm of India. We have 25 years of independence around there. And, we have about 60 million people. You have 1 billion people, and your challenges are huge. So I recognize that, but I'll make some comments in my presentation about NEPA. They may come across as critical, and but I say it with all the humility, and I'm trying to make a contribution to the broader debate, and that's my emphasis. And it's going to be an input that is very respectful of what people have done in India in education. I think people have done a lot of good work in India in education, and there's a lot more to do in the world. But I've read with interest Dr. Gandhi's innovative work regarding literacy. And I think my presentation on social justice in education can shed some light, or can supplement the work of Dr. Gandhi's organization. I think some phenomenal work has been done. And there are two critical interventions I want to suggest to create a wider audience that takes interest in the large majority of children that are marginalized. Maybe I should just say that again. There are two critical interventions that I want to suggest to create a wider audience, or more support, that takes the large majority of children that are marginalized. So in other words, we need more people to take a greater interest in children who are marginalized in the world. And I think the dominant narrative in the world in education at the moment is money, its power, and its personalities. And money, power, and personalities as relegated education. But I'll talk more about that. Now, one of the observations I've made is the issue of operational capability of developing countries to address vulnerability. I think we need to develop a planning tool in the developing world, not only in the developing world, but in the developed world as well, where there are vulnerable children. Because the problem is that the privileged children and the children who are wealthier, who will do anyway better at school, are at the center of the education department's planning. And the planning for the vulnerable children is on the margins. And it should be the other way around, because in developing countries, the majority of children are vulnerable. And secondly, I made this point earlier when I started, was that we need to get higher education to change the narrative in the faculties of education. Because the narrative in the faculties of education focuses on Bloom's taxonomy. It must move from Bloom to Maslow. Because the majority of vulnerable children haven't gone through those self-actualizing steps. And so I don't want to impose a Eurocentric model, but what I'm saying is, what we need to do for literacy is to ensure that children have the basics. And if they don't have the basics, then the government of the day must own the problem. We can't allow a situation where masses of children are alienated from the mainstream education system. Now, I don't know how you understand social justice, but I'm using a definition of social justice that's been spoken about by John Rawls. And he talks about two fundamental principles. Each person has an equal right to a fully adequate scheme of equal basic liberties, which is compatible with a similar scheme of liberties for all. That's possible. That's possible if we plan properly. If the education departments in vulnerable, where there are many vulnerable children, bring vulnerability to the center of education. And the second principle is social and economic inequalities are to satisfy two conditions. First, they must be attached to the offices and positions open to all under the conditions of fair equality of opportunity. And second, they must be to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged members of society. So what I'm saying is very compatible with the statement. These principles are very compatible with the statement I made earlier. Now, Mr. Butt, when he started off, he spoke about SDG 4 and Sustainable Development Goals 4 is to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education for all and promote lifelong learning. But what can we see of SDG 4 at the moment? SDG 4 is rhetoric because there isn't a methodology, and departments in developing countries as well as the developed countries, right? They don't have the operational capability to implement SDG 4. So it's like the Salamanca statement that we had many years ago in Spain. Departments of education have been signatories to inclusive education, but they don't have the operational capability. So when I talk about operational capability, you have a policy paper, and your policy paper is sits on the shelf, and you announce it and you say, well, we're implementing inclusive education, but there's no changes to the organogram of any department. The organogram is your structure of your department. Ideologically, the narrative does not change and impact on the thinking of people. So the old notion of a bureaucracy must be called into question. So, many years Max Weber spoke about the bureaucracy and what the bureaucracy means, and I'll touch on this a little later. The notion of a bureaucracy and the way it operates is inconsistent with the goals of SDG 4. Now, I know that's a mouthful, but I'll try to explain that. So in the developing countries, in the developing world, we have a fundamental problem with human agency from a social justice perspective. The other point I want to make is that education transformation is very complex for bureaucracies. But it's more complex when there are high inequalities in society. The bureaucracy struggles to deal with the inequality. The bureaucracy struggles to deal with addressing and ameliorating the situation or improving the situation. And the reason why is because if you look at social paradigms and if you look at inclusive education, there is a totally different theory, there's totally different assumptions, there's totally different models, and there's totally different practices. And bureaucracies don't have the sociological understanding and the pedagogical tools from a social justice perspective. So inclusive education sits within the paradigm of social justice. But you tell me, how many countries in the world have a cohort in their leadership that understands social justice and is able to theorize it, understands the assumptions, develop models, and advance practices based on social justice, right? So context of vulnerability presents huge challenges to policy planners across the world. And so my work over the next 3 or 4 years is to develop a planning tool based on social justice. So I want to take the work of John Rawls, and I want to take the work of Amartya Sen. You must have read about Amartya Sen. And look at providing a framework for education planners across the world and provide them with what the implications of that framework is for practice and what that framework means for employing personnel, for budgeting, for utilizing the resources of the department, and then translating social justice into action in terms of programs. So I don't know what the demographics is of Delhi, or the demographics is of Lucknow, or the demographics of Mumbai, or the demographics of Bangalore. I don't know what it is. But what I know is from NEPA and the analysis of NEPA is that a large percentage of children cannot read and write. So I was talking to Mr. Butt earlier on about this issue, right? But I want to take you back a little, right? I'll come to that point in a moment. One of the biggest problems facing developing countries is that they're following a Western model. And if you if you understand and see British education, Tony Blair said many years ago, and Gordon Brown said many years ago, that education is about being busy. And so the way I interpret that education debate is that education needs to show that they are busy. But there is no human values in that statement. There is no caring in that statement. And so the whole world has this challenge. So you have the TIMS, you have the PISA, you have the Pearls, you have the Finland education system marketing itself across the world. But we live in a very different context. And we want to show that we are good at the PISA, we are good at the TIMS. And what is the consequence of that? The consequence of that is that the majority of vulnerable children fall off the system, because you are focusing on the rich kids and the middle class kids who will anyway pass an education system. So we have constructed a pedagogy and an education model that is not relevant to the most of the learners in the world. And they are mainly vulnerable children. Why? You have to ask yourself the question, why haven't we made much progress with the education of the poor since the introduction of mass education? Because the focus has been on the top. Because Max Weber will tell you, and other people who talk about the sociology of the bureaucracy will tell you, that the bureaucracy is there for itself. It has a self-serving purpose. But listen, I've met wonderful people in education across the world, working in bureaucracies, Scotland, in Mexico, in India, in the United States. Wonderful people. But as far as understanding the task at hand, there's a huge challenge. So, Joseph Stiglitz told us, he was the old advisor to President Clinton. He wrote a book called Making Globalization Work. And he advises developing countries that their future depends on what they do as a country. It's clear that developing countries cannot rely on handouts from the developed world. And in order to flourish, and for our citizens to flourish, we need to take policy planning very seriously. So this is my commitment over the next 3 years. So we have a similar problem to you in South Africa. In the place where I live, 50% of the people earn a poor salary. 50% of the people or more have low education levels. And that's one of the reasons why we came up with Education White Paper 6 on special needs education to build an inclusive education training system, is to develop a new narrative for education. But as I explained to you, it is a challenge. Now, if you look at India and if you look at NEPA, National Education Policy Act, they talk about special education teachers. Every teacher in India must be a special education teacher. Every teacher in South Africa must be a special education teacher, because the majority of children are vulnerable. And the findings of the National Achievement Survey in 2017, conducted in India, found that foundational literacy and numeracy was a huge problem. We have the same problem in South Africa, but your problem is of a much bigger in terms of numbers because of the population. But if you have systemic reform, you can't have piecemeal changes. The education system needs to take ownership of vulnerability. And every decision that's made in the education department should ask the question, does this decision reduce inequality in any significant way? So once they came out with the National Education Policy Act in India in 2020, the statement made this kind of comment. It said, the role of families and communities intertwined with teachers should be leveraged to increase the demand for education. Now, with due respect to the Indian policy planners and makers and so on, I don't think that that's the only way to solve the problem. NEPA should have more operational capability. In other words, it should change its narrative about the way it thinks about education. Because so many people in India have a literacy challenge. The ownership, the decision-making, the budgeting, the allocation of human resources, retraining people in social justice. What's the new theoretical framework? What's the framework of NEPA if it's committed to social justice? What are its fundamental assumptions? What's its model? What's its practices? What's its tools? So if every single educationist in the education department understands the new way of thinking and the new way of doing things, things will change. Right now, and I'm saying this with the greatest respect, if you ask Virat Kohli and the Indian cricket team to announce literacy as a major objective of life, it'll make more progress in the education department. Because there isn't a common understanding, and I've seen that in many countries in the world. So in 2018, I wrote a book called Inclusive Education in South Africa and the Developing World. And there I say that all these countries have made piecemeal changes, put a policy on the shelf and said, we're doing something about it. And I can understand that because the backlogs are so big, It's such an immense task. It is so intimidating, and there's so much of pressure on the system. But that's not what education is about. Education is not about show and tell. Education comes from the heart. It's about helping children. It's about seeing the oneness in humanity. It's about love and transformation. And that's the way I have learned about education. So I don't see education as about my ego or about the ego of the system. It's about love, transformation, and caring for humanity. The poorest children in the rural areas must get a great chance to read. So there's something else I want to say, which I think is very important. And that is, and this I think is what Dr. Gandhi's main focus is, that the ability to read is a social justice issue. Those learners who are unable to read may not be part of the mainstream economic and social life when they're adults. So there's this Chilean reformer who did a lot of work in Chile called Schiffelbein. And you can read up some stuff on his work. And he says that if a child doesn't learn to read by the age of 8, that child may not finish school. That child may drop out of school. And how many children learn to read reading by the age of 8? So what would I do? Where 50% of the population is unable to read for meaning, where 50% of the people earn very low salaries, where 50% of the people are not role models for the children because they didn't have good education, good formal education. The one thing is that you have to provide psychosocial support to learners in the early years, because there is too much of pressure and there's very little, there's so much of anxiety and pressure, there's very little cognitive space to learn reading. There's very little cognitive space to acquire oral language. If there's no oral language development, if there's no print culture, if there's no reading to children, children won't read. You cannot teach anyone to read. You have to make reading possible by providing this culture, this print culture, by reading to children, showing them the print as a message. But in the poorest communities, if you take the United States, if you take the African American population, they have been reproduced for 150, 200 years. There's a school to prison pipeline, a country that can have a football game and celebrate it every weekend of the year, that can send people to the moon, but have not taken care of the most vulnerable children. So I was in Philadelphia because I studied at Penn State College, and I was learning all this theory. And I said to the professor, listen, can I go to the districts and do an analysis of what's going on and look at the relationship between theory and practice? And all the Latino kids and all the African American kids were struggling in those schools. This was many years ago. It hasn't changed. And so let's not think that the West as a solution to our problems. Let's try to understand our context, right? Now, to explain this problem in greater detail, if you look at research, there's some research done in New Jersey where they said that a middle-class family, a professional family, like my children, middle-class family, they get exposed to 45 million words by the age of 4. A working-class family, the people who I'm talking about are struggling, have a exposure to a vocabulary of 13 million words by the age of 4. That's if they are in a relatively good environment. But the environments that we have, that you know, where there are poor homes and so on, are far more extreme. And there's much, so the gap when the children go to school is huge. So my task, my job over the next 3 years is to create an environment and like-minded people and a tool for planning and asking questions about social justice. And I think that in the world today, if we don't do that, if we don't make that effort, a lot of work has been done in this area. A lot of work has been done. But the dominant narrative is personality, power, and money. It has relegated education to a secondary status. And so what I want to do is, in practical terms, is to make people understand, in terms of social justice, that they are not mainly problems within individuals. They are systemic problems that exclude children from school, lack of access to the curriculum, inadequate policy, poverty, lack of parental involvement, language, inaccessible environment, lack of access to basic services. So we developed this narrative, a barriers to learning narrative, a social justice narrative, and we create the conditions for success. So you have to ask the question, this is my conclusion, you have to ask the question honestly, you have to ask the question, what theoretical work has gone into NEPA? I'm not saying they haven't done their job. I'm asking, let's ask the question, what theoretical work has gone into NEPA? What were the fundamental assumptions of the previous model? And what are the fundamental assumptions of the new model? How has thinking changed from the old to the new? And what methodology has been used to translate the new into action? So, Mr. Butt, that's my final question. What was the methodology to translate the new into practice in the education environment?
Thank you, Professor Sigamoney, for this, like really thought-provoking presentation, and to look at education and literacy as social justice is often something which, like you also said, that is often kind of gets lost out in the top echelons of the government or the bureaucracy. And it is something which has to be at the very core center of things if you want to talk about transforming the realities of foundational learning, especially. I mean, education as a whole, but especially if we talk about, like you also mentioned, about literacy and the exclusion of so many children from this very foundational, the very basic ability to read, write, and do arithmetic. It is a social justice. And thank you so much for helping us unpack as to how social justice is to be looked at in the case of education. You made an important point about this often kind of lack of alignment or mismatch between bureaucracy and issues of social justice. And if we are talking about reform, then one way to look at reform could be through a top-down approach where the politicians and the top-level government policy makers and the bureaucracy get together and say that, okay, we're going to make a transformational change, versus something change which kind of starts at the very grassroots or at the bottom up approach. If we look at developing countries, be it like South Africa or India or other countries as well, what would you say are the possibilities with respect to uh, transformation change in this particular area of education? Does it need to be top down, or does it need to start more at the bottom up level, or is there another route to achieve this?
Okay, that's a good question. Well, I would think that you need to create a space. And that space must be created by the education department needs to take ownership of that space. So if the education department doesn't take ownership of it, there is no way you're going to succeed, because they have to look at the implications of their policy, the policy that they develop. What's the implications for the structure of the organization, who they employ, where do they locate it within the education department? For example, in your education department, you have an education department and you have a section for disabilities, a department for disabilities. Now that is contradictory, because I'm not being very critical, right? But I'm just saying it doesn't make ideological sense, because it's inconsistent with the theory of inclusion. NEPA is inclusive. They came out with the inclusive education paper, but you got a department for disabilities. I'm not equating disabilities with inclusion. If somebody can't read, that's about inclusion. If children are struggling with the curriculum, that's about inclusion. But to have a section on disabilities and then have the education department that's responsible for other policy means that hasn't been thought about. Now, you have the same problem in Norway. You have the same problem in other countries in the world. So the education department has to take ownership. So people like Dr. Gandhi can do some wonderful work by helping the education department achieve its objectives, because they have taken ownership of the problem. Now, that's a problem in many developing countries. And I think the fear is that they don't want to look like a second-class education department. They want to be tops in PISA, they want to be tops in TIMSS, they want to be tops in all these different testing regimes, which are useless for developing countries. That's my opinion. And many people will disagree with me. I'm going to go and say that in a conference on PISA and TIMSS and PEARLS at the end of November. I'm going to say to the people who are advocates of it that it is not good for developing countries. Because what it does is it marginalizes the poor learners. The schools don't want to take poor performing learners. They want to take the best kids, because they want to be like the league tables in London. They want to be the best schools. And the best schools means you leave out the kids who are struggling. Sorry for digressing.
Thank you for your thoughts on that, Professor Sigamoney. And you raise an important point that there are these compartments of governance, and in many countries you do see that, for example, something like early childhood education is covered by a separate department of women and child development, for example, in India. And within this education department, you would have a separate department for school education, a separate thing for adult education and literacy. So, whereas all these are in a way, kind of a spectrum, or are so interlinked as well. Is there any evidence from a country uh, where departments, where the planning, the governance and the planning has been able to align well, especially in the area of social justice? Because we're very excited to know about this tool also that you are building. Do you see any evidence in any of the countries where this has happened successfully? And if you'd like to share a bit about that.
Well, I've identified the problem, and I think the problem is this. I will read you Max Weber's definition of a bureaucracy, and that's the problem, right? All these countries are controlled by a bureaucracy, but bureaucracies were never designed for transformation. Bureaucracies were designed to maintain the status quo. Listen to this definition. The classic model of bureaucracy is typically called the ideal Weberian model, and it was developed by Max Weber, an early German sociologist. Weber argued that the increasing complexity of life would simultaneously increase the demands of citizens and for government services. Therefore, the ideal type of bureaucracy, the Weberian model, was one in which agencies are apolitical, hierarchically organized, and governed by formal procedures. So what the bureaucracy does is it focuses on procedural correctness. And when you focus on procedural correctness, you have no interest in the outcome. The outcomes become secondary. So with SDGs at fundamental transformative agendas, all right? And SDG 4 on inclusive education, it is located within, outside the paradigms that most bureaucracies in the world operate in. So that's the challenge.
Right. It's so interesting that I mean this particular ideology on which the bureaucracy is defined is so permeating across each and every country and continent, and so standardized in its ideology. Another aspect which also we wanted your thoughts on was with respect to often if you look at the classroom level, right? So I mean the actual place of exclusion is the classroom. And in many countries, and especially in countries like India, you see that public education is the cadre of teachers that you have often belong to a different economic and a social class as compared to many of the children that they are teaching. So when it comes to social justice, do you sense that this schism, or like this a difference in the socioeconomic status of a teacher versus the student might be a challenge to social justice? And how do you sense things can move forward with respect to that level, at the very classroom level?
It is the biggest challenge facing the world. School leaders are key to addressing this issue. School leaders, school leadership, and the people who control education. Each child, each intelligence, and each challenge must be celebrated. To do this, the leadership must practice self-examination, understand how institutions and agents contribute to social inequalities in education, and foster equitable schooling conditions of all students. To be effective school leaders in an unequal environment, school leaders should be social justice leaders. School leaders need to gain critical understanding of their personality and privilege and be prepared to engage with difficult conversations with each other. Now, you see, this is a challenge across the world because I really battle with this, and it relates to my past. So can I talk about that so you'll understand where I'm coming from? So I grew up in an area in the south of Durban. No, not in the south of Durban, in central Durban, in South Africa, in Natal. And my parents lived in a non-racial area. But apartheid started in 1948. Institutional apartheid started in 1948. And so we were moved out of the area as Indians. So the Indians moved into one area, the so-called Africans moved into another area, and the white people moved into another area. And so when I grew up, when this happened, I realized there's something really wrong with the system. Then we went to school, we went to primary school and high school. So we were working class people. My father had 5 kids. And, he had to really discipline himself and really work very hard to give us education. We were all 5 kids and we all got educated. But so we grew up in a working class Indian area in Natal. And so when I got into university, we were involved in the anti-apartheid struggle, and I realized there was something very wrong with education. So I did my master's in the United States, and I did my doctorate. I got a scholarship for my master's, and I did my doctorate, and I committed myself to understanding why children fail in school. Why is the education department failing? Why is the system failing? And when you ask me this question, I realize that you have to have a consciousness to understand the diversity in your classroom, to understand what poor means and what's the relationship between poverty and education, you need to have a sociological understanding. And it's a point of frustration because I notice many people around me did not blink when they saw that 50% of the children could not read for meaning. Because there's a relationship between reading in the foundation phase and finishing school. So what's missing in education, and it's surprising, is a sociological analysis. And there isn't a sociological imagination. And so that's one of the things that I want to do, is I want to create the conditions for that sociological imagination. But when I do finish my work, my optimistic self tells me it will influence a few people. But the world is 4 or 5 billion years old, right? And there's so much of poverty in the world. So I ask myself, given this position of privilege I'm in, what kind of contribution can I make to poor children? Children who grew up next to me, and some of them never finished school. And we had teachers who were apolitical, who believed in the status quo, who actually promoted apartheid in a sense. Indian people and black people promoted apartheid. So that's the most difficult challenge we face in the world, is an unreflective teacher, a teacher with a lack of consciousness. But listen, how did Virat Kohli become such a good batsman in cricket? How did the Indian cricket team become so skilled? Okay, they did badly on Sunday, but how do you? There's a way. There is a way, and we have to find that way. We have to create the conditions of success for children to succeed in schools, and it starts with the education department. That's what I'm saying. It starts with the education department. You create that consciousness, see the link between literacy and getting into a university, or you don't necessarily have to get to university, but finish your schooling. How many children finish their schooling in India and in South Africa? That's our problem. So it's an engagement, it's a conversation. I would say, if I have to make the decisions, I would use the Indian cricket team to promote literacy and reading. I would use the most popular sport in the country and use the social media to show the relationship between reading books and reading. I would use whatever tools at my disposal to promote education and show the relationship between lack of socialization into intellectual culture and failing, and socialization to an intellectual culture and success. Long answer.
Very powerful thoughts, Professor Sigamoney. It's really triggering in terms of um, how you've kind of helped us understand, that the lack of sociological perspective is something which is often very pervasive, and it's really something which we were mentioning before the talk started, where you mentioned about the concept of Atma and the soul, and it's something which needs awakening at all levels. Here, towards the end, I would also like to invite Dr. Gandhi as well, who's been listening intently to your talk, and would invite her thoughts and comments and questions possibly.
Sure.
Yes,
Hello.
Sigamoney. Hi, it's lovely to see you in this StreamYard session
You
of
too.
dtalks, and delightful that we can be deliberating across continents. Um, and issues are yet so global and so real, and there's always this question of why are we not able to make a dent in the point that you just made, and that how do you go about making a dent. um, why is it that we are still struggling with the most fundamental of issues, making people literate? And how, I mean, the real issue is how. And you've talked about, maybe tie up with people who are like in sports, popular media, and so forth. It's a struggle, though. Do you agree? I mean, like, really, it is not easy to make a dent because we have to have buy-ins from the government. At the top level, I think there's a lot of maybe they're gatekeepers to the old. They tend to think what they've been doing is also a future plan of action. And so the change happens at best incrementally, and not dramatically or in terms of a paradigm shift. Here we need to maybe also highlight the need for literacy to be on the agenda, topmost agenda of the governments, because I mean, I think a lot of governments think in short term. They're not thinking literacy, they're not thinking education in that big way. And precedence seems to guide our efforts of the future. What are your views on that?
Say the last comment. I didn't catch the last comment. What
Yeah,
guides?
precedents, like what has happened in the past. So, for example, the textbooks that have been used, the way of teaching, the way of 3 years to become literate. All these are like old and passe. There's a lot of good research out there, worldwide research, that shows there are better ways to teach and better ways to do things. Yet it's such a slow and cumbersome process because partly because though there are lofty statements by the governments, they're not translating into action at the.
Sorry, have you finished? Sorry, have you
No,
finished?
no, this is all. This is all. Thank
Okay.
you.
So, Stephen Ball wrote a book called The Education Debate, and I mentioned this in my talk about it's busy. Education is busy, and Tony Blair and Gordon Brown started that old narrative, right? That's actually dominating the education environment. So the first point you make about gatekeepers, yes, nobody in a senior position in a bureaucracy, the way Max Weber defines it, would like the bureaucracy to look bad. So, for me, this is the most painful thing, that education has now become an economic commodity. It's packaged in a particular way, as you say, it's packaged in a particular way. And, when Mr. Butt spoke about the Atma and the compassion and the expansion of love, that's gone from education. And so that's what we need to bring back. And there's no other place in the world that you can bring that back with a lot of sense is in India, right? In South Africa, there's a concept called Ubuntu, which is a similar concept. It's a traditional concept about caring and expanding love. And so I think education has been taken over and has been relegated by people, personalities, and power. And the biggest impediment to education are bureaucracies. And I'm going to prove that in the next 3 years. The biggest impediment to education is bureaucracies. Because if you go in there, if you go in there with your credibility and what you're doing in India, they'll find you very challenging. They'll find you in opposition to what they're doing. They don't see that you have a common goal, and we are committed to the collective good of the world. Now it's about I and my, not we and ours. That's the problem. And so, what's his name? This great linguist from America, Chomsky. Man, if you just do any YouTubes on Chomsky, and the man has gone really old now, he looks so tired, but he's battled this ideology for decades. But you know what? Never give up hope, because every one child you help is good enough. Everyone who comes past your way. I saw Melita's pro pic with 2 little girls. She's walking with 2 little girls. I assume that's one of the children you teach. And, I think that's the most powerful advert for humanity. And that the people that make this commitment to the poor must be strengthened all the time. And we need to develop a network. And we need to create the conditions for people to succeed and help vulnerable children. So I've made that my goal, and I don't have any apologies for it. With the most powerful people, I don't have any apologies. Sorry for the
Totally
long-winded
agree.
answer.
No, totally agree. I mean, ultimately, it's about um, getting a critical mass of people who believe, that helping one person is good enough. So it's that one fish I saved, one starfish I saved, and if we all work for it, like the phenomenon that has taken place, for example, East and West Germany, the Berlin Wall coming down, it was because so many people thought about it at the same time, and they consciously acted towards it. So there's a critical mass of people, and I think here also we probably have to go, as you're saying, the top down bureaucracy is tough, so we may have to go bottom up. We may have to make more people concerned about the other, and there is of course a helper's high. When they help, they feel good. So they should have in their hands, in their minds, a vision, uh, in their heart the love. You talk about the love, and
Yeah.
in their hands the tools to make it possible. So I think a lot of people want to do good, no doubt. So there's the heart and the head, but the hand, like having the toolkit to make people literate is probably missing. They think it's a long-term process, and they both the learners and the people who are teaching them lose hope along the way because it's taking too long. So here we've been working with some disruptive methods of teaching and learning, experimenting with ideas that you can teach in a very, very quick span of time. So why should
I've
it take
seen.
3 years when it can take 3 months?
Yeah.
And if it can take 3 months, then everyone can get involved,
Yeah.
and therefore we can do a lot more. So I think we're very hopeful because of this toolkit that has emerged from this process, of interacting with the people who are struggling to read, but they know the language very well. They know everything in the language. They need to, like, this is a table, this is a chair, I want this, for my lunch I want, they can talk everything. Why can't they read the alphabet? I mean, it shouldn't take so long. So I think we are definitely needing more disruptive solutions, and exploring different disruptive ways to get out there. So what you're proposing, and it makes sense, is that the ordinary person making that conscious act and doing something about it, and then maybe you create a critical mass somewhere, and it becomes an international phenomenon. So it looks hopeful. We're not giving up hope, as you said. Don't give
Yeah.
up hope.
No, you can't. The person, Melita, showed me what you do. Yes, you're
Yes.
right. The people know the words, and they know the language, and they've been, and you can make a difference. But I think what we need to do is we need to mobilize people across the world. We need to mobilize people in the United States. We need to mobilize people in the UK. We need to mobilize people in Europe, and we cannot make this a developing world problem. And we can't allow these people to dominate the narrative, because they do dominate the narrative, but they don't examine their own privilege. What we have to do is we have to mobilize people to ask the critical questions about how bureaucracies undermine the the developing world, right? And you see, in the big picture, I just think that from a humanitarian perspective, we cannot allow so many children to be uneducated and illiterate, and we cannot use the SDG goals as a token, because it's got no methodology. We have to point this out. And so these people come with these global narratives without a sense of the local context, and to the detriment of the majority of people. Listen, I don't know how far we've moved from slavery. And sometimes I ask the question, can you wear a suit and be a slave? And my answer is yes. You can be a slave in a suit. But the only difference between us and animals is our intellect. We have to use our intellect to help the people. And so I think you're doing that. I shouldn't be talking to you about this, but you asked me to speak, and I think, maybe we just need to build a network, talk to more people, And I spoke at the ISEC conference in London in August, and immediately after the conference, a PhD student contacted me, and she said to me that in Wales there are so many single parents, and that's one of their biggest problems. Now think about it. Would we ever imagine that the way they construct their narratives? And more recently in the UK, they said that the budget has been cut by the Conservative government for vulnerable children in some area. I can't quite remember what area it was. But the person said this. It was done in such a clinical way. So, people like us who are educated should challenge the status quo when it undermines the well-being of the collective good. I'll stop there, right?
Yes, a good point to end the detox. It's a really profound statement, and we definitely want to march along with you and join hands with you and do what we can while we are still on planet Earth.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're going to talk again. Great stuff.
Yes,
yeah.
right.
We're going to talk again, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So here I would like to thank Dr. Gandhi for her thoughts and questions as well, and Professor Sigamoney Naicker. It's been truly wonderful and refreshing to hear your thoughts. Really profound, and I think the ideas that you've shared are gonna stay with our audience and grow as we take them back to our work and our communities. And we're also very excited and looking forward to the outcome of the research and the work that you're doing with respect to developing this tool, which puts social justice at the very center of education planning. And I'm sure that this is something which is going to be very helpful for communities, not just in South Africa, but around the world as well. And we hope to welcome you again to share what the outcome of that research is. We would absolutely love to share it with the audience. So on that note, Professor Sigamoney, thank you so much once again for your time for joining us on dtalks.